The excitement of camping out for the weekend filled the air as we trudged through the thick forest, my friends and I buzzing with energy and anticipation. I was 13, feeling like I was on the edge of adventure, and having two older siblings, Margot and Todd, with us gave us a sense of security. There were 7 of us in total, each one of us eager to leave behind the routines of everyday life and spend a night under the stars. After a while, we found the perfect spot, a small clearing surrounded by tall trees that created a natural canopy, shading us from the last bits of sunlight. We set up camp, dividing ourselves between 2 tents, the boys in one, the girls in the other. As dusk settled over the forest, we felt a satisfying sense of independence and excitement. The air was cool, filled with the chirps of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves, a reminder that we were truly out in nature. Later that night, as the quiet settled in, Margot muttered something about hearing tapping outside our tent. We laughed, dismissing it as a tree branch brushing against the canvas in the wind. But as the night deepened, I found myself awake, listening to the sounds outside. That's when I heard some light knocks on my tent. I froze, listening harder, and then a low, eerie giggle. It sounded close, too close. I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself it was my imagination, a trick of the mind that would go away if I ignored it. After what felt like forever, the sounds faded, and I drifted back to an uneasy sleep. The morning arrived with a sense of calm, the events of the previous night slipping away as the sun rose. We shook off the remnants of our fears and decided to explore the trails nearby. The boys stayed behind to keep an eye on camp, while the rest of us took a hike to a nearby overlook. The forest seemed inviting in the daylight, each trail winding through the towering trees and leading to new discoveries. It felt good to be out there, leaving the unease of the night behind. But when we returned to the campsite, that sense of peace shattered. Our tents had been slashed, long, jagged cuts ran through the fabric, leaving them in tatters. My stomach twisted as I inspected the damage, trying to process who or what could have done this. And the boys said they didn't go that far. They always stayed relatively close to the camp. But the evidence was undeniable. It looked like the cuts had been made with a pocket knife, precise and intentional. And then we noticed something else. Todd's car, our only way out, had its tires slashed too. Panic settled over us as we realized the full extent of our situation. We were stranded, isolated in the woods with no cell service and no way to call for help. Margot, always the calm one, took charge, saying she'd go with 2 friends to find help, leaving the rest of us to guard the camp. As they disappeared down the trail, I felt a creeping dread, the feeling that we were not alone and that something or someone was watching us. With Margot and 2 others gone, we huddled together, the remnants of our makeshift camp a stark reminder of the vulnerability we felt. Todd, now our de facto leader, tried to reassure us, but unease lingered. The forest, so inviting in the daylight, now felt ominous and suffocating. Every sound seemed sharper, every shadow longer, as though the trees themselves were closing in around us. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. We sat in silence, glancing around, waiting for Margot to return with help. But as time wore on, a creeping sense of fear took over. Todd suggested we start walking toward the main road instead of waiting, a decision we agreed to without hesitation. Moving felt better than sitting there, surrounded by reminders of whatever or whoever had done this. We packed what little we could carry and set off, our footsteps the only sound breaking the forest's quiet. But as we made our way through the trees, I began to feel something else, a prickling awareness of eyes watching us. The sound of snapping branches and faint footsteps seemed to follow us. Every few minutes, one of us would look back, only to see nothing but the stillness of the forest. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The tension broke when Todd suddenly froze, his eyes fixed on something far behind us. "Run!" he shouted, his voice filled with urgency that sent a jolt of fear through all of us. Without looking back, I took off, my heart racing as I heard the others' footsteps pounding beside me. The urge to look over my shoulder was overwhelming, but I kept my focus forward, trusting Todd's instincts and the fear in his voice. As we darted between trees, I dared a quick glance back. In the distance, I could see them. 3 hooded figures, standing just far enough away to blur their faces. They were tall, each over 6 feet, and as they moved, I caught the glint of something in their hands. Knives? I couldn't be sure, but the sight was enough to push me to run faster, adrenaline drowning out everything but the pounding of my heart and the sound of snapping branches as we fled. The chase seemed to go on forever, our breaths coming out in ragged gasps as we stumbled through the forest. Finally, when our legs could hardly carry us any further, the footsteps behind us faded. We slowed, huddling together, each of us gasping for air and casting anxious glances around. It seemed they had given up the chase, but the fear lingered, heavy and unshakable. Just as we were catching our breath, Margot and the others appeared on the trail, relief flooding their faces as they saw us. We hurried to them, explaining everything that had happened in panicked whispers. With her guidance, we made our way back toward civilization, each step taken with caution, our eyes scanning the forest for any sign of the figures that had chased us. When we finally reached the nearest police station, we recounted every detail, hoping they could find some trace of the strangers. But after hours of searching, the police returned with little more than our own torn tents and scattered footprints around the camp. Whoever those figures were, they had left no evidence beyond the slashed fabric and our shaken memories. We never found out who they were or why they had stalked us. And though we left unharmed, the question remained, haunting and unanswered. What would have happened if Todd hadn't noticed them in time? Spring had finally arrived, and with it came the promise of a family camping trip we'd looked forward to all winter. The plan was simple: a few days away from everything on a quiet, remote beach, just us, the open sky, and the steady sound of waves. My parents, my younger brother, and our faithful dog, Parmesan, piled into the car that morning with high spirits and even higher hopes. Parmesan had been a rescue dog, and though she'd had a rough start, she was fiercely loyal and a constant source of joy for us. For her, this trip was as much an adventure as it was for us. As we approached the campsite, the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the sand and turning the sky into shades of orange and pink. We were surprised to find that we were the only ones there. This beach, usually dotted with tents and campers, was strangely empty. But we brushed off our concerns, figuring it was just a lucky chance to have the place to ourselves. My parents set up the tents, my brother and I gathered driftwood for a fire, and Parmesan bounded around, sniffing every shell and scrap of seaweed with intense curiosity. The quiet was soothing, almost too quiet, but the beauty of the setting sun and the calm of the evening distracted us from any doubts. We were looking forward to a peaceful night by the fire, the world reduced to just the glow of our campfire and the gentle lapping of waves on the shore. Just as we settled into the evening, unpacking the last of our supplies, a figure appeared on the distant road leading down to the beach. At first, it was just a shadow against the fading light, a person walking toward us with a slow, uneven gait. As he drew closer, we saw the glint of something metal in his hand, and it became clear he was holding a knife. My heart raced as he stumbled toward us, his expression wild and his movements erratic. My dad stepped forward, trying to reason with him, his voice calm but firm. "Is everything okay?" he asked, trying to create a barrier between the stranger and the rest of us. But the man didn't respond, only gripped his knife tighter, his eyes darting between us with a strange, unsettling intensity. His gaze lingered on each of us, sizing us up, and an uneasy silence hung in the air. The stranger took another step forward, his face twisted with anger or desperation. I couldn't tell which. The tension grew thick as we backed up, inching toward the car, trying to keep a safe distance. My dad held his ground, but I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that gripped all of us as we realized just how dire the situation was becoming. The air was thick with tension as the stranger continued his approach, his grip tightening on the knife as he edged closer. My dad kept his voice steady, trying to defuse the situation, but his words didn't seem to register with the man. He was focused, almost fixated, on us, as if we were the only thing in his world. I felt the weight of dread settle over me, the terrifying realization that this man wasn't going to back down. Just then, before any of us could react, a blur of movement shot past me. Parmesan, our rescue dog, had leapt from the car, her instincts kicking in. She darted toward the stranger, her barks fierce and sharp, her body tense and ready. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter, and her sudden presence caught the man off guard. He stumbled back, his gaze snapping to the dog that now stood protectively between him and us. Parmesan's barks grew louder, more insistent, and for a moment I saw a flash of fear in the stranger's eyes. His grip on the knife loosened as he backed away, realizing he was outmatched by our loyal protector. With a final bark, Parmesan lunged, and the man, finally rattled, turned and staggered back up the road. The tension broke as he disappeared into the shadows, but the fear lingered, leaving us shaken yet grateful for Parmesan's fearless intervention. With our adrenaline still surging, my dad quickly gathered us all, urging us to throw everything back into the car as fast as possible. None of us wanted to stay a moment longer. The night had taken a sinister turn, and the beach that had felt so peaceful now seemed threatening. We managed to load up quickly, with Parmesan jumping in last, her eyes still trained on the road, alert and protective. On our way out, we stopped briefly at a small petrol station to refuel. Just as we began filling the tank, a chilling sight met our eyes. The stranger was there, watching us from across the station. The sight of him made my skin crawl. He seemed to be waiting, lurking in the shadows, his presence unmistakable. We hurried to get back in the car, but before we could leave, he got into his own vehicle and began following us. My dad floored the gas pedal, but our fuel gauge was alarmingly low. We were running on fumes, and the thought of breaking down with him behind us was horrifying. Every mile stretched on, the tension in the car palpable as we glanced back, watching his headlights remain a steady presence. He followed us for miles, each second intensifying the dread, until finally, at a fork in the road, he took a different route. The relief was overwhelming, but the fear lingered as we drove on, barely making it to the next town. We reached the safety of a small town, hearts still pounding as we pulled up to a local police station. We reported everything, detailing the stranger's approach, Parmesan's brave intervention, and the harrowing chase. The officers took our statements seriously, documenting every detail, and assured us they'd look into it. We later heard whispers that the man might have been connected to a recent series of crimes, possibly even a murder suspect, though we never received a full confirmation. The thrill of freedom after high school was fresh, and the world felt open and boundless. My friend and I decided to celebrate by going camping, even though we knew next to nothing about how to do it. The plan was simple: head to Inyo Canyon, set up a tent, and spend a few nights under the stars. With only a vague idea of where we were going and what we'd need, we packed up, fueled by equal parts excitement and naivete. We arrived late, the daylight already fading, casting long shadows across the unfamiliar landscape. There was no campground in sight, just the empty, looming presence of the canyon, shadowy cliffs towering around us. With no flashlights, we relied on the car headlights and our lighters to help us set up the tent in the middle of nowhere. Every flicker of light outside the tent felt eerie, but we convinced ourselves it was part of the adventure, even as every crack and rustle in the darkness amplified the isolation we'd put ourselves in. Setting up camp was harder than we'd anticipated. Each sound from the canyon walls, each gust of wind, seemed to highlight just how alone and unprepared we were. But finally, after a lot of fumbling in the dark, we managed to put up our tent. We crawled inside, trying to shake off the unease, and settled in for the night, convincing ourselves that everything would be fine in the morning. The relief of daylight was instant. When we woke up and saw the vast landscape around us, I realized just how poorly we'd chosen our spot. Rocks, uneven ground, and a complete lack of any amenities told us we were definitely not in a designated campground. After a quick breakfast, we decided to move and soon found an actual campground nearby, one with marked spots and even a few other campers, which put us a little more at ease. Setting up properly this time, we relaxed in the tent, laughing over our amateur mistakes from the night before. It felt good to be settled, the tension of the previous night fading as we joked and talked. We felt safe in a way we hadn't the night before, more grounded now that we were in a real campsite with other campers not too far away. As the sun began to dip, we retreated to the tent, still sharing stories and planning the rest of our trip. The unease that had gripped us in the darkness seemed distant, replaced by the comfort of a good day. We were finally getting a taste of the camping experience we'd imagined. But as night settled over the campground, that sense of safety began to unravel in ways we couldn't have expected. But just as we were starting to let our guard down, a strange sound interrupted our conversation. My friend stiffened, his face scrunching up as he looked down at his foot. "Something's tapping my foot," he whispered, sounding more amused than alarmed. I laughed, assuming he was just spooking himself out, but he was insistent, shifting his foot and listening closely. We joked it off, blaming it on stray pebbles or a breeze outside, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. Moments later we heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel and growing closer to our tent. The steps were heavy, each one calculated, and they stopped just inches from the entrance. A chill ran through me as we both sat frozen, staring at the tent zipper that separated us from whoever, or whatever, was outside. My heart hammered in my chest as we watched the faint outline of a shadow moving just outside. Suddenly, a flashlight beam swept over the tent, its harsh light casting eerie shadows inside. The beam stopped directly on the zipper, illuminating it in a way that made me feel as though we were being watched through a thin, vulnerable layer. I felt my breath catch, and before I could stop myself, I shouted, hoping to scare them off. But there was no response. The flashlight stayed fixed on the zipper, and whoever was out there remained silent. The fear was suffocating, pressing in from all sides as the beam clicked off, plunging us back into darkness. Whoever was out there was still there, and they had no intention of making themselves known. The silence was deafening, thick with unspoken threat. Desperation overtook me, and in a low, shaky voice, I whispered that we had a gun, hoping the bluff would be enough to drive them away. For a long, tense moment, there was no movement. Then, finally, we heard the crunch of retreating footsteps. They moved slowly at first, then faster, until we were alone again in the silence. The threat dissipating, but the fear remaining. When dawn finally broke, the relief was overwhelming. The light filtered through the thin walls of the tent, casting away the shadows and bringing a sense of clarity. The events of the night felt surreal, but as we cautiously unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the reality hit us hard. There, imprinted in the dirt around our campsite, were the unmistakable marks of boot prints leading away from the tent. Whoever had been watching us was no figment of our imagination. The deep grooves in the dirt were fresh, leading away in a direction that disappeared into the trees. We exchanged a look, silent but knowing. This had been real, and we had no desire to see if they would return. We quickly gathered our belongings, throwing everything into the car without a second thought. It was an experience that marked the end of camping for both of us. The May long weekend was a tradition for us, a time to escape the city and enjoy a few days by the lake, camping at our usual spot with friends. The air was crisp, the water calm, and the surrounding forest gave us a comforting sense of isolation. We'd made this trip many times before, and everything about it felt right. Our group was large enough to feel lively, but small enough to keep things relaxed. The first night passed peacefully, filled with laughter around the campfire. The stars reflected on the lake as we shared stories, roasting marshmallows, and soaking in the simplicity of it all. As day turned to dusk the next evening, a new group arrived at the campsite below ours. They seemed lively at first, playing music and laughing loudly, but as the night wore on, their volume escalated to shouting and blaring music that reverberated through the trees, clashing with the tranquility we'd come for. At first, we brushed it off, hoping they'd quiet down as it grew later. But by midnight, their noise had only intensified, drowning out even the gentle sounds of the lake. Ben, one of my friends, decided to go down and ask if they could keep it down. We watched him go, a lone figure heading into the darkness, hoping he'd return with good news. Instead, when he came back, he was clutching his face, blood trickling from his nose. A punch was their answer to his polite request. An uneasy feeling settled over us. As some of us tried to shake it off, I decided to head to bed, leaving a few friends still up, casting wary glances toward the neighboring camp. In the quiet of the tent, I tried to sleep, but an underlying tension gnawed at me. Even as I lay there, the rowdy group's voices drifted up the hill, filling the night with sporadic shouts and laughter that didn't seem to die down. My friends stayed awake, their nerves heightened after Ben's encounter, trying to keep an eye on the camp below. Sometime later, I drifted off, but the night would soon shatter that brief sense of peace. When I woke, it was to the sounds of chaos outside, screams piercing the silence, urgent voices calling out for help. I stumbled out of the tent, disoriented, my heart pounding as I took in the scene. Ben was on the ground, clutching his chest, his face contorted with pain, while others were screaming for someone to call 911. I quickly learned that after I'd gone to bed, our neighboring group had mistaken Derek, who was returning from the forest, for Ben. Without warning, they'd attacked him and his girlfriend with a bottle, escalating the violence. And then 2 of them had come up the hill toward our camp, brandishing knives. In the confusion, Ben had been stabbed in the chest, and Tim, who'd tried to intervene, was stabbed in the stomach. The sight of my friends, injured and terrified, left me frozen, unable to fully process the violence that had invaded what was once our safe, familiar campsite. The air was filled with panic and the urgent shouts of my friends as we tried to understand the situation. Derek stood off to the side, his arm around his girlfriend, their faces pale from the shock of being attacked. Nearby, Ben lay on the ground, clutching his chest, his face twisted with pain and confusion. Tim was hunched over, pressing a hand to his stomach where he'd been stabbed trying to defend Ben. I looked around, feeling a surge of helplessness. The realization that we were far from immediate help, isolated in the woods with no way to quickly get medical attention, hit us all at once. One friend had already dialed 911, his voice tense as he relayed our location and the extent of the injuries. But the operator informed us that the ambulance was over a half-hour away, an eternity under the circumstances. Each minute felt like a countdown, the situation growing more desperate as we waited, watching our friends in pain. As we tried to stabilize them, I could see fear in everyone's eyes, each of us grappling with the reality of the night spiraling out of control. We had expected a peaceful trip, but now it felt as if the wilderness itself had turned hostile, every shadow hiding a new threat. We knew we couldn't wait. Our friends needed help now. With the ambulance too far away, some of Tim's friends took action, deciding to drive him to meet the emergency responders halfway. They quickly loaded him into a car, the urgency pressing them forward as they sped off into the darkness. We gathered around Ben, who, though injured, chose to stay with us, his resolve unshaken despite the pain he was clearly in. The attackers had fled into the woods after stabbing Ben and Tim, their shadows vanishing down the hill toward the lake. But the fear lingered, knowing they were still out there, the violence fresh in our minds. Ben's breathing slowed as he lay back, his hand pressing against his chest, while we kept a wary eye on the surrounding darkness, alert for any sign that the attackers might return. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the police and an ambulance arrived. Tim's friends had managed to meet the paramedics along the way, and he was already on his way to the hospital, fighting through the pain of his severe injuries. The officers took statements from each of us, documenting every terrifying detail as we recounted the night's events. They assured us they would search for the attackers, who, as we later learned, hadn't gotten far. Their vehicle had gotten stuck on the lake bed, giving the police a chance to apprehend them before they could escape. Both Tim and Ben survived, though Tim's injuries were severe, leaving us all shaken by how close we had come to something unthinkable. The memories of that camping trip lingered, a stark reminder of how quickly safety can shatter. Even now, I can't forget the feeling of waking up to chaos, the sight of my friends fighting for their lives, or the chilling realization of how close we came to tragedy. In the summer of 2016, my husband and I embarked on our honeymoon, a 20-day camping trip in a remote mountain area, hoping for a peaceful escape into nature. It was everything we had dreamed of, just us, our 2 loyal dogs, and the vast untouched wilderness. The air was crisp, the sky a clear blue, and the scent of pine trees filled the camp as we settled into our secluded spot, eager to make memories far from the busyness of everyday life. The first few days were everything we'd hoped for. We spent our time hiking, enjoying long conversations by the fire, and taking in the scenic beauty surrounding us. Our dogs were in their element, exploring every nook and cranny around the site, their tails wagging with excitement. It felt perfect, like the beginning of a new chapter, a fitting start to our lives together. But on the third day, something changed. We were sitting outside our tent, drinking coffee and talking quietly, when a woman appeared at the edge of our campsite. She approached slowly, her gaze fixed on our dogs, and asked if she could pet them. Her presence felt strange, unsettling, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. When we politely declined, she lingered, standing in silence before eventually drifting away without another word. We watched as she walked toward a nearby tent site that belonged to two campers who were away. Unease settled over me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that our peaceful retreat had been invaded. Over the next few days, the woman's presence became harder to ignore. She was no longer just a passerby, but an unsettling fixture in our surroundings. She would appear in odd places, standing motionless on a trail or watching us from a distance as we hiked. There was nothing outright hostile in her behavior, but her silent observation made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. It was as though she was studying us, an intruder in what we had hoped would be our private sanctuary. The most disturbing part was the way she began to focus on my husband. She'd position herself in clear view when we were outside, making exaggerated attempts to appear seductive, her eyes fixed on him in a way that was impossible to ignore. We did our best to brush it off, but each encounter left us feeling more unnerved, our once idyllic honeymoon shadowed by her increasingly brazen behavior. One evening, as we sat around the campfire, we saw her standing just within the tree line, her gaze locked onto us. We couldn't hear her, but her presence spoke volumes, as though she was daring us to react. We didn't know what she wanted, but each passing day left us more unsettled, with the creeping sense that she was waiting for something, biding her time just outside our reach. One afternoon, I decided to head to the communal showers, hoping that a moment away from camp might give me a chance to clear my head. But as I reached the small shower building, my heart sank. The woman was there, lingering at the entrance. She didn't acknowledge me directly, but her presence filled the small space, casting a tense shadow. I slipped into a stall, hoping to avoid her, but I could hear her voice drifting from the next stall over. She was speaking with two young women, the rightful occupants of the campsite she had taken over. Her voice was eager, almost desperate, awkwardly inserting herself into their conversation. She mentioned plans she'd made for them all to hike together, even though they seemed uncomfortable and unresponsive. The encounter left me shaken. Her attempts to integrate herself into the lives of strangers were unsettling, her behavior tipping from odd to invasive, even threatening. That night, the unease lingered, and sleep came in short, fitful bursts. Then, at 3 a.m., I jolted awake to the sound of a scream, a raw, blood-curdling sound that pierced the quiet night. My husband shot up, eyes wide. There, illuminated by the dim moonlight, stood the woman. Her gaze was fixed directly on us, her face partially hidden in shadow. Before either of us could react, she turned and disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the darkness, leaving us shaken to our core. The following day, our friends arrived, bringing a brief respite from the tension. We hoped that the added company would deter the woman, but her behavior only escalated. That evening, as we gathered by the fire, she approached our group, a strange, unsettling smile on her face. Without hesitation, she asked if she could stay in our tent. Her voice was flat, her gaze unblinking as she looked directly at my husband. We all exchanged glances, the discomfort palpable. She began making inappropriate comments, her eyes lingering on him in a way that made my skin crawl. We tried to ignore her, politely declining, but she didn't leave. She stood there, her presence imposing and unnerving. Then she reached into her bag, pulling out a hammer. She gripped it tightly, her knuckles turning white, her stare fixed and unwavering. The silence was suffocating, each of us holding our breath, unsure of what she would do next. For a moment, she just stood there, the hammer clutched in her hand, the firelight casting flickering shadows on her face. Finally, she turned and walked away, disappearing back into the darkness. But the threat lingered, unspoken yet undeniable. The next morning, we woke to find her campsite in chaos. Her belongings were scattered across the ground, her tent partially collapsed, as though she had abandoned everything in a fit of anger. Relief washed over us, thinking she might have finally left. But as the day went on, that hope faded. At sunset, my husband and I decided to take one last walk to the lookout point. As we reached the edge of the clearing, I felt a prickle of unease. Across the field, half hidden by trees, she stood watching us. Her clothes were torn, her hair disheveled, a haunting figure silhouetted against the twilight. For a few moments, we locked eyes, a silent standoff filled with tension. Then, without a sound, she turned and vanished into the forest, leaving us with the heavy certainty that she was still out there, somewhere close. We didn't wait until morning. Gathering our things in silence, we packed up the trailer and left. In the end, what we had planned to be a honeymoon full of joy and tranquility turned into fear and unease.